The Urbanist is brought to you in association with the Department of Culture and Tourism, Abu Dhabi. Saadiyat Cultural District Abu Dhabi is a beacon of hope and inspiration. A catalyst to spark growth and collaboration with museums and experiences, where art and science and nature and technology coexist.
The belief of Abu Dhabi that culture is the backbone of our society.
Stay tuned for a special episode of the show, in which you can hear His Excellency Mohammed Khalifa Al Mubarak explain exactly why and how Saadiyat Cultural District Abu Dhabi is the perfect place to collaborate, create and innovate. Saadiyat Cultural District Abu Dhabi, proud partner of The Urbanist on Monocle Radio.
Hello and welcome to The Urbanist, Monocle's programme all about the built environment. I'm your host, Andrew Tuck. Coming up.
We get to see a lot of different depictions of earthquakes, different stories, but in each case, I think we see that there's an attention given to the city, back to the city, in order to preserve what's out there and rebuild and reconstruct the city one more time.
We assess the future for the Turkish city of Antakya, which is facing an enormous rebuilding process following a catastrophic earthquake in February 2023. On today's show, we speak to an historian to uncover the layers of sediment that tell a story of Antakya's shaky past. We hear from some of the people behind the bold reconstruction plan for the city, and we get inspired by a designer aiming to mitigate the effect of future tremors through floating architecture. All that coming up over the next 30 minutes, right here on The Urbanist with me, Andrew Tuck.
After so much destruction, so much noise, for those waiting beside the remnants of their homes in Turkey and Syria's earthquake zone, it is now the silence that is deafening.
Shaken to their foundations, whole buildings fell. And across southern Turkey, peace became panic.
14 centuries of history crumbled in less than 2 minutes in Antakya following last Monday's quakes.
Authorities are asking them not to return to their homes. It's very dangerous. Even the buildings you see behind me that are still standing may need to be put down because the infrastructure has been compromised.
Locals here say that reconstruction is going far too slowly, with many people still living and working in tents.
Can Antakya rise again after this one? Sadly, the scale of the damage must raise serious doubts. The place known in the Bible as Antioch may now be nothing more than ancient history.
On February the 6th, 2023, a 7.8 magnitude earthquake struck southern and central Turkey and northern and western Syria. Hundreds of aftershocks occurred in the hours following, many of them severe. One of the worst areas was the southern Turkish city of Antakya, an ancient site of huge significance, particularly ecclesiastically, to empires throughout the centuries. Antakya suffered extensive building damage and large numbers of casualties, with many of those that survived left homeless. A number of historical sites, including important churches and mosques, were also destroyed. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan promised an immediate reconstruction, but many feel that the rebuilding efforts have been slow and underwhelming, especially considering the scale of the task ahead. However, in October last year, a consortium of architects led by Foster and Partners was selected to devise a plan for the next era of Antakya. We'll be exploring that rebuilding plan on today's show, but before we get to that, we wanted to look at the history of earthquakes in the area and how the city in particular has recovered in the past. We were recently joined by Suna Chayeptai, an historian and archaeologist who has worked in Antakya, who discussed the area's history and assessed what might come next.
My name is Suna Çağatay. I'm an associate professor of architectural history and archaeology, teaching at Muğla University in Turkey. And I also direct the excavations in the city of Antakya or Kadıkadesi in Kuşadası in Turkey. I've been working on the dynamics of cultural overlaps, urban memory, and heritage. And in that regard, Antakya is one of those cities that gives me a great platform to play with all those ideas. As a scholar, I also work on the earthquakes and their impact on human life and urban frameworks. Previously, I worked on the first Ottoman capital, the city of Bursa, and how that city's urban fabric was intervened by an earthquake that took place in 1855. And Antakya is also one of those cities that have been dented by the earthquakes quite often. My final trip to the city, it took place in September 2022. And I went there with two of my colleagues from the University of Cambridge. I was working for a project that was called The Impact of the Ancient City at the Faculty of Classics there. And I was working on the archaeology and the urban fabric of the Eastern Mediterranean cities. And Antakya ranked really high among those cities. Our project aimed to study the afterlives of the classical cities under Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And my PI from the project, he was writing a monograph, and he said, "Do you care to accompany me when we go to Antioch?" He was writing a monograph, and he had a big chapter on Antioch. So I went there with him, and our main aim was to study the patterns of urbanization before and after the earthquakes, especially the ones that took place in the Roman and Byzantine times. So we traveled around the city and we were able to see how Antioch was almost like a zone that was compressed in place with very significant 20th and 21st century creations. But they also collided a lot with the ancient and the medieval remains. So we strolled through the streets and tried to examine the deep stratigraphic record in the city. You know, we see the occupations, disruptions, reworkings from the Roman to the modern times. And there we also, managed to visit one of the world's largest mosaic floor that is roughly around 9,000 square feet with really undulating surfaces. And it just speaks for how earthquakes were part of daily life in Antioch. I think, in order to understand or in order to feel hopeful about the events that are going on in the aftermath of the earthquake, I think we should just turn our back and look at history of the city. The city, it had so many earthquakes, especially the one in 115 AD. In that earthquake, in the aftermath of that one, they decided to build the street, the Cardo, which is a street running from north to south. They decided to build that street wider, and they decided to clear out all the rubble along the line of the street. And then when you look at the 526 earthquake, which took place during the time of Justinian, one of the greatest Byzantine emperors, we were given a lot of information written by John Malalas, a native to the city as well as a Byzantine historian. And he talks about the magnitude of the earthquake. He talks about the lives that were lost. He says 250,000 lives were lost. And then he also says, after the earthquake, there was a fire, and it just brought a complete breakdown of the local government. Raiders and the thieves began stealing from the survivors. So the picture that Malalas depicts for us, I think it's very similar to what happened in Antakya in the aftermath of the earthquake that took place in 2023 on February the 6th. All that, people suffering under the rubble, being trapped beneath the rubble, for longer periods, the amount of lives lost, it is in a way very similar. And he gives a very vivid description of the damage created by the earthquake. And then later on, in the later parts of the medieval period, in the 12th century, in the 13th century, we get a succession of earthquakes. And this is the time when the city is under the control of the Mamluks. And the Mamluks, they try to do something very different. They mainly focus their attention on the public buildings. They try to preserve the mosques and so on, but they don't want to preserve or reconstruct the city walls because probably they feel like they are in charge of the city and they don't feel any political or military threat from any other cultures neighboring them. So we get to see a lot of different depictions of earthquakes, different stories, but in each case, I think we see that there's an attention given to the city, back to the city, in order to preserve what's out there or salvage what's out there and rebuild and reconstruct the city one more time.
My thanks there to Suna Jayaptai. Now for some background on the rebuilding process that is ahead for Antakya. Our correspondent in Turkey, Hannah Lucinda Smith, sent us this report.
The city of Antakya was almost entirely destroyed in the earthquakes that struck southern Turkey and Syria on February the 6th, 2023. 80% of its buildings collapsed or were damaged beyond repair, and thousands of its people were killed. But this is the start of Antakya's renaissance. That's the sound of the ribbon being cut at the launch of the new Antakya. A consortium of architects led by Norman Foster and Partners has created a master plan to reconstruct and improve its urban fabric. But this is not an easy task because Antakya is no ordinary city. The complexity of rebuilding Antakya isn't just about the scale of the damage. This is one of the most historic and complex cities in Turkey. It's home to different communities, Sunni Muslims, Alawite Muslims, Christians, Jews, all of them with their churches and synagogues and mosques in the old cities and other historic monuments. It's not just the people of this city. There are people and religions and groups around the world that feel they have a stake in Antakya's history and in its future. The old part of Antakya will be faithfully restored. Architects have poured through archives to find historic maps and plans that detail the dense mishmash of its layout. Although Antakya is in Turkey, the flavour of its old city is far closer to Aleppo or Damascus. It was a maze of alleyways and courtyard houses huddled around the mosques, churches and synagogues. But Antakya is not only a heritage site, it's also home to around 400,000 people, most of whom are still unable to return. 15 months on from that earthquake, Antakya is a building site. There are still places which are just rubble, there are still buildings which are half collapsed. Just walking past the old city, I can see that it's still entirely uninhabitable. That was one of the worst affected places during the earthquake. And just looking around, I can see that there are quite a lot of houses marked with Yıkılmayacak or Devaliye. That means that there's a court case going on, that a decision's been made to destroy the building, but the owners are fighting that in the courts. So, yeah, there's one here that says Mekami Yıkılmayacak. Yeah, it means it's in the courts, don't destroy it. Another one says Hasarsız Yıkılmayacak. That means that there isn't any damage, even though the houses surrounding it are damaged. The first part of the plan covers the newer part of the city centre, which was previously made up of unorganised and often dilapidated buildings. The architect's first task was persuading local residents to trust them. Here's Serhat Başdoğan, General Manager of the Turkey Design Council, the body which brought the consortium of architects together.
At the beginning, of course, we had negative thoughts for the project because there are some architects came to their city all over the world. They are afraid what they are doing. But we organized more or less 35 workshops, 10 of them with locals, 20 of them together with the architects, 4 of them with the international groups, and 4 of them also open for the whole city. Then slowly they were thinking that there's something good for us, and at the end there is a hope.
For this pilot stage of the reconstruction, parcels have been handed out to different local architects who have each come up with plans for modern apartment blocks that reflect the culture of the city. There are wide balconies where families can socialise under the warm Mediterranean sun.
and inner courtyards, landscaped and filled with fruit trees and flowers. The idea is to keep as much of the original city layout as possible, but also to take this opportunity to improve Antakya for the people who live in it now and in the future.
And it can be a model. Design can be a humanitarian aid. This is our motto.
For Monocle in Antakya, I'm Hannah Lucinda Smith.
Thank you, Hannah. Earlier in the year, Monocle's Lillian Fawcett had the chance to speak with Lucia Iliapoulou from Foster & Partners, one of the architects working on this upcoming rebuild plan. Let's have a listen to their conversation.
It's a completely different challenge when you build a city from scratch, and I've been involved in master plans like that. But here we're rebuilding a city in situ. We don't start from scratch. In the cases when in Sicily, for example, in 1968, they built completely new towns after the earthquake next to the earthquake-stricken villages. In the case of Antakya, we're building the city in place. So it is important to restore the sense of place. And the sense of place is basically the mental map that all the residents have in their mind of their city. And that means when we ask them to describe it with a single word, usually they mention smells, food, or communal spaces and social spaces and commercial spaces in the city. That was one of the community engagement methods that we used, and we are also about to launch an online platform where we can engage people wherever they are, because unfortunately a big portion of the population has left the city today. So we want to engage as broader audience as we can, and again using their senses, and because I think this is important. It's impossible to rebuild it exactly as it was, because in the same time we're trying to get inspired by the past but also look towards the future. So we want to retain as much as possible the scale and proportion and articulation and richness of colors and materials, but in the same time pave the way for Antakya 2.0, which is improving infrastructure first of all, building resilience, so looking for a pedestrian-friendly solution. We know that Antakya, the previous version of Antakya, had some, for example, issues with traffic, so we're trying to address some of the things that the residents were concerned about in the past and improve them now. We have the chance. We have, let's say, this chance of a sustainable transformation of the city. So it's a fine balance, and that's why the community engagement is so important in the process. It's an open-end game, basically. It doesn't have a stop and an end. And that's why what we're doing is not designing, is like we define the design framework. And that's why we call it framework, because it's a constant engagement and active listening and negotiation with all the stakeholders involved. And as cities are living organisms, we believe that this is how Antakya will also be, right? It doesn't have a beginning and end. It's an open-end process, and it will evolve, and we want it to evolve naturally over time.
How aware were you of history and trying to honour it in your plans for the redevelopment?
We are engaging with a lot of local historians, so we found a lot of people who are locals and they are from Antakya and they have an academic background, so we have calls with them on a weekly basis. Some of them have also PhDs on Antakya and the evolution of Antakya over the decades and centuries, but of course we try to understand the history. I just want to clarify that the master plan that we are doing is on the western part of the river, which was built in the mid-90s under the French influence. So that was a little bit later. The eastern part of Antakya, it's the ancient city. So we are trying to unpeel all the layers, using a lot of local advisors. The understanding the context is the most important thing, but the layer of people and what people think of the stage of Antakya just before the earthquake, I think is the most relevant layer for us, because we had a lot of discussions. Which layers should we restore it to? Is it the French layer? Is it the Ottoman layer? Because there are layers upon layers. So we took the decision, after speaking with the locals, that what is important is to restore the place as it was just before the earthquake, because the local communities who actually live there are the ones who we want to invite back. So their opinion and their memories of this place is the ones that matter. So we are using this as our baseline, and we are working towards improving that baseline. Out of all the interviews with the locals, there were just a very few people who mentioned architecture and buildings in the responses. And usually people with academic background, they did mention the courtyard houses in the historical part of Antakya, but most of the people talk about relationship, community relationships and dynamics, the importance of streets, the importance of local jobs and local shops, the importance of smells, materials were mentioned, stones, but not necessarily about the architectural typology. So I think our starting point is we want to preserve as much as possible in terms of alleyways and streets, because that's the veins of the city, right? And it actually we want to preserve the people's memories of navigating through their city, which is, I think, important, how to find your way around the city. But in terms of architectural style, we want also to give freedom to all the local architects involved, who are, of course, local, so they know, they understand the context, to be creative. So we don't want people to stop being creative. But we're trying to retain as much as possible the scale, the proportion, and the richness. So that's our framework. Now we want people to be able to be creative within this framework, because we are building the city today and for the future. So it's a mix of many variables, I would say. Another lesson learned from other post-earthquake reconstruction case studies, for example, from Sicily, is that it's a fine balance. You shouldn't build too fast, neither too slow, right? When you build too fast, this implies top-down approach. First of all, you need to be modular, you need to define a model that could be replicated very easily, and that leads usually to uniformity. And so basically, because you're missing out all the layers upon layers that usually cities have. On the other hand, you don't want to do it too late, because people lose hope and they place roots elsewhere. So it's a fine balance to maintain the richness, I would say. That's why I think it's important. It's a good plan that we are engaged in a lot of different local architects. So it's not one architect who is doing everything. So we will be able to see this expression of different architectural, let's say, expressions in the buildings. And that, I think, will contribute to the richness that we're trying to create.
Lucia Iliapoulou there in conversation with Lillian Fawcett. Finally today, we look at one innovative idea for how to safeguard buildings against the devastation wrought by earthquakes. Joining me now is Inanç Iray, a partner at Sauer Studios, a global design studio with the mission to address social and urban problems. Inanç has produced a proposal for Izmir Sustainability Centre, or SAL, which is designed as Turkey's first floating public building. This idea hopes to mitigate the effect of earthquakes while also producing a sustainable and energy-efficient design. Inanç, I know for a generation of Turkish architects, these disasters must make you think about the ways in which you build and how to prevent future devastation. Just tell us about how you've come to be involved in this project and what your beginning point was.
Being part of the East and North Anatolian fault zones, Turkey is basically experiencing frequent earthquakes. And like growing up in Turkey, you grow up with it. And naturally, the seismic loads are the most important. And therefore, I think building codes and the legislations are very strict and diligent. And coincidentally, Antakya, where the last earthquake happened, is home to my father. So as an architect, this latest earthquake became like a personal as a professional endeavor for me to rethink how we built. We've been working since the aftermath, doing emergency shelters first, and transitional housing, and finally with the Turkish Design Council, along with like Foster and Partners, DB Architects, BRK Engels, and 20 plus local groups, like working out how to rebuild the city. That was a great kind of opportunity for us. And we took it even further, led the field research and participatory design efforts, talking to the community. I think two insights came out, which was maybe unexpected. One thing is like we realized Antakya was demolished. This was the sixth time. It's the seventh time it's being rebuilt, which kind of means that every time the code was getting more strict, more conservative, let's say. But I feel like building stronger would be never enough. A mind shift is needed. And the second one is that the sea become kind of the safe zone. When the critical infrastructure, like the airport, even if the building was there, the tarmac was destroyed. It was really hard to carry out the immediate rescue and relief efforts. So most of the help come from the sea, even like they retrofitted some of the ships into becoming temporary hospitals. So I think in that sense, like there was a bit of like a lighting bulb in our heads, maybe floating structures could be utilized like in this kind of earthquake disaster. So that was, I think, the beginning of that.
When it comes to the sea, the other interesting thing is, that places like Izmir and many places along the Turkish coast are associated with boat building and shipbuilding. So many of the skills that you need to think about aquatic structures, you have a skill set there, I guess, that you can tap into as well.
Right. I mean, historically, Turkey has always had like a very advanced shipbuilding technology. I mean, geographically, we are surrounded by three major water bodies, the Black Sea on the north, the Asian Sea on the west, and the Mediterranean on the south. And I think culturally also, it's one of the core aspects of the everyday life, from transportation to shipping to tourism, even to food, like people live by the sea. In that sense, I think like there is many examples of barge structures also utilized as like ferry terminals, transportation nodes, recreational and entertainment venues, nightclubs, and even like floating swimming pools and restaurants. It's still functioning there.
And tell us about the building that you've designed then to be a floating structure. Sal, what's your idea for heading out on the water?
Sal basically directly translates into a floating body, like a barge. And the journey started with a national architectural design competition. Izmir, the city of Izmir, was looking into building a net zero sustainability center. But mainly, like, the Gulf of Izmir is on a very high risk plate. Its liquefaction is very high. So before even building anything, you need to do a lot of like ground improvements. You need jet grouting, piling. You need to somehow fix the land before putting anything, which was super contrary to a net zero building, right? So that was similar time. We were dealing with Antakya projects, and like you said, like maybe there's an opportunity here to build a new typology, like a building with no ground and no foundation that is actually not taking any earthquake loads on it. So it can become immune to maybe floods. And with the climate change, the rising sea levels may not be the issue anymore. So it can be transported, or it can be somehow mobile, can be used as an emergency structure whenever needed in case of an earthquake. So that goal, basically, we collaborated with the Dutch engineering firm, Bartel and Weathers. You know, in Rotterdam, canals and like this inner lands are very much used. And that's kind of there every day, especially in Netherlands. And they supplied us very crucial information. And that's how Sal came about, like as the Turkish first public floating building.
And tell me, Inanç, I guess it's great to have a series of buildings on water that can be safe in the case of an earthquake. But the reality is that the majority of people are going to have to live on land and are going to have to probably face more earthquakes in the coming years. How do you think that these examples, though, can feed into other architecture in a city? You know, is it about also raising the conversation, raising standards? Is there more that can flow from this than just a series of buildings that may stay intact if there was an earthquake?
Especially in Istanbul, I think about 40% of the building stock is like old at the moment. They're all made out of concrete structures and with heavy, let's say, rather cheap building materials. So in that sense, they will have to be somehow upgraded. But the land is expensive, and in a way, the country is choosing to create infill operations rather than creating floating structures. And then the infill land becomes a problem for any earthquake. So I think that floating structures can be a great response as a natural disaster resilience aspect.
Just tell me also, when you came to build your structure, were there challenges? How easy is it to create such a large centre that's sustainable, that's easily accessible, that moves but doesn't move too much? Did it immerse you into a different world of engineering and of understanding how bodies of water work?
I mean, I think the fascinating bit is like the floating structure has to be sustainable by design. You have to build an agile structure that has to be lean. There cannot be any fluff. There cannot be any fat in it, basically. Because the more weight you put on it, it increases the center of gravity. And in order to not to float too much, let's say, you have to keep it low. So in a way, it has to be light construction. It has to be either like timber or lightweight steel. And the barge structure also allows you to, like a car, you have to somehow maintain it frequently. So that's actually the good thing. You are now aware of your defects of the structure. You are now using more sustainable materials. You are using more lightweight construction. So in case of an earthquake, the devastating outcomes will be prevented, hopefully.
And finally, just tell me, what's your hope? Could we see this structure arising? I know it's won awards and people have talked highly of it. How hopeful are you that we will see this amazing building erected on water?
I mean, I'm super hopeful. I think it brings the conversation of circularity, upcycling to the table. We can, again, utilize part of all decommissioned ships to create the barge itself. And I'm hoping like the newly elected mayors also like coming from the similar background. So like they will support this idea. I think it will be fantastic.
Inanç Eray, thank you for joining me. And that's all for this week's episode of The Urbanist. You can get new editions of the show every week. Just follow us through your favourite podcast provider. And you can also subscribe to Monocle magazine for regular reports on all things design, architecture and urbanism. Just visit monocle.com. And another thing, why not join us on Monday the 15th of July in Paris for a live edition of The Urbanist? Myself, along with Saint-Gobain's Vice President of Communications, Laurence Pernaut, will be speaking to an expert panel about building better cities. And it's going to be followed by a reception at the Saint-Gobain HQ. For more information and to RSVP, simply contact Hannah Grundy on events@monocle.com. The Urbanist is produced by Carlos Rebello and by David Stevens, who also edits the show. I'm Andrew Tuck. Goodbye. Thank you for listening, City Lovers.